I'm thankful for all the tools that God gives us and for wonderful buildings, but these are just suits that are on the body of the church. And the body of the church, that we are light and we are salt, and we're called to make a difference. And what a wonderful message, and what a blessed way to receive that. This morning, I want you to take your Bible and turn over to the book of Mark, chapter 6. We continue our study there. There are, if you look at the Gospels, there are 4 Gospels. We call them Gospels in the Bible. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We believe probably Mark was written early as they're all considered biographical in the sense that the people that write these are actual witnesses there and tell the story and the experience of watching Jesus through his life and his ministry, through his passion, death, burial, and resurrection. And we have Mark, the early one, and then Matthew and Luke were written soon after that, and probably had Mark maybe even as a resource, we're not sure. But they all are writing to different audiences. Matthew writes to mainly a Jewish audience so that they'll believe. And you'll hear Matthew say a whole lot in there, and that's why he's referring back to the Old Testament prophets. They knew about the prophets. They knew about the Torah. So he'll say, as the scripture is fulfilled because this was spoken. So that audience understood. Mark's written to a Roman audience, and so they are thrilled with action. So he'll say, I think 44 times he says immediately. He just jumps from one situation to the next, and so they're thrilled with that. And then you have John. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are the synoptic gospels because they all tell many of the same stories, many of the same sequence. John's written a little bit later in a different story, and same story but a different viewpoint, and he is trying to tell about the Logos and about the Word, and so he's describing that. He says, these things have I written that you might believe that Jesus is the Son of God. So they're all written from a different perspective, but they tell the story of Jesus. If you're ever on Jeopardy and you're given the final Jeopardy question, what is the only miracle other than the resurrection? The resurrection, of course, is a miracle, and it's told in all 4 Gospels. The only other miracle that is told in all 4 of the Gospels is what we will look at this morning. So your answer will be, what is the feeding of the 5,000? Let's look at that this morning, at this wonderful miracle, and just try to put yourself in the place of these disciples in this experience this morning. We'll begin reading Mark chapter 6 and verse 30. The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him and all that they had done and taught. Remember, he'd sent them out by 2 on the mission trip, and they came back and their experience there. And he said to them, come away by yourself to a secluded place and rest for a while. For there were so many people coming and going that they didn't even have time to eat. And they went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves. The people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. And when Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. It was already quite late. His disciples came to him and said, this place is desolate. It's already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But Jesus answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and spend 200 denarii, about 8 months' worth of earnings? Shall we spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat? And that word would mean just a mouthful, just a bite. And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go look. And they found out, and they said 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. And they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. And they took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looked up toward heaven. He blessed the food and broke the loaves, and he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them. And he divided up the 2 fish among them all. And they all ate, and they were satisfied. And they picked up 12 full baskets of leftovers, of the broken pieces, and also of the fish. And there were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. If you just put yourself in the midst of this story, you have to recognize that this is a very difficult time. Jesus has been to his hometown, and those people who you would think knew him the best, and they thought they knew him the best, they rejected him. There wasn't a hometown welcome for him. He wasn't welcome there. We're told that at one point they thought about throwing him off a cliff or stoning him. They had rejected him. There as he left that, then he sent his disciples away. They had come back off this mission trip. They were all exhausted, excited, but they were exhausted. And then he gets the word that his cousin, his friend, the forerunner to his ministry, the one that he had enough confidence in that he wanted him to baptize him in Jordan, John the Baptist, had been beheaded by Herod Antipas. And that news came to Jesus. And so at the midst of that circumstance, Jesus said, you know what, we need a little retreat. Let's get away for a little bit. Let's draw aside. And as they tried to go to a retreat area, people saw him and they watched and they ran alongside. And it says whenever he came on shore, that they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he had compassion on them, so he began to teach them. And his disciples said, look, Lord, it's supper time, and this is a desolate place. This is like Becker, Mississippi. There's not even a McDonald's here. You're going to have to send them away to the other towns and let them go buy something to eat because we don't have enough. And then we have this wonderful story as Jesus divides them into small groups. Let me just say that's important. We do that every Sunday morning. We've had groups that have divided up this Sunday morning, and how important being part of a small group, an intimate group where you study the Word and where you know one another's names and pray for one another's lives. We try to do that with our deacons and the caregivers and try to see the families come together. That's what we want to happen. And that is important. And so Jesus does that for a legitimate purpose to be able to divide them up, but how we can translate that into our life. But as I said when we started this study in the book of Mark, that there is a miracle in every parable, and there's a parable in every miracle. Every miracle that Jesus performs, he is trying to do more than just the miracle. It's not just out of compassion that he heals and he performs these miracles. He is trying to teach a lesson as well. And yet whenever Jesus now in this is teaching a lesson to these disciples, they don't get it. They miss the point. The reason I know that, if you'll skip down to verse 52, it says this. It says, for they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. His disciples missed the point. What I want to do this morning is I want us to not miss the point. What can we learn? It is a wonderful miracle. Just to look at the logistics of the miracle is just overwhelming. But let's not miss the point. And so this morning, let me just go ahead and jump into the lesson that Jesus wants us to learn from this miracle. What's the lesson to learn from this miracle? And there are going to be three things. The first one I think that they all missed was that you should never measure your problems in light of your own resources. Never measure your problem or your circumstance or your situation only in light of your resources. And we do that sometimes. We see a problem, and the first thing we do is that we we count our change, and we want to see, do I have enough financial resources? Do I have enough emotional resources to be able to invest in this? Am I going to be able to see this through? Am I going to be able to walk through this? And I want us to learn that lesson, to never measure the problem just by what you have available in your own resources. The disciples didn't learn that lesson. And so let's be sure and not miss that lesson this morning. Peter Lord, some of y'all may remember Peter Lord. He was pastor at Baptist Church down in Titusville, Florida for years and years. I think up until he was 82, and still speaks at conferences. He was a forerunner before it became a popular term in discipleship. He was a pastor's pastor. He really, back in even the 60s and the early 70s, he had some little phrases that he coined. Probably the most famous one is, make sure the main thing remains the main thing. And for us at church, it's sometimes that we lose sight of what the main thing of the gospel is and what the main thing of discipleship is. And so as we learn that main thing, Peter Lord said that there are three in every church situation, every circumstance within the church, and especially every problem that comes up in the church, and usually in every family as well, that there are three kinds of people. There are three kinds of people that to respond to circumstances or problems, especially in church. First of all is what he called them feelers and figures and faithers. The feelers are those people that they judge life by saying, well, I feel like this is what we ought to do. Or I feel like the Lord is telling me to do this. I feel like this is what I ought to do. There's nothing wrong with feelings, don't get me wrong. God made us. He made us emotional. He made us to have feelings. And I've said it many times, I wouldn't give you a wooden nickel for religion I couldn't feel. I believe that God means for us to have feelings about what we're doing. But whenever we allow our feelings to dominate, then our feelings can lead us astray. Our feelings can get in the way. So let me take the word faithfulness. That is what we want to exhibit, is faithfulness. But if you concentrate more on the fullness, and that's what leads you in what you do, then that's going to be a distraction at times. It's kind of like physically. We want to be full. We have an appetite. We grow hungry. We see a need. And so we satisfy that need and we get full. And that fullness, that's a good feeling, isn't it? It's good to feel full. But after a while, have you noticed? After a while, that kind of wears off. And that fullness, and there's another need. And if that is how you govern your life, then you're always going to be kind of distracted. It is faith that we're led by. Faith is the substance. Faith of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So that faithfulness, if that's what leads us in our life, then we'll come to a point to understand that it's not our resources. So there's the feelers. Are you feeling through life? And then there's the figures. I had a cousin that would misuse a good southern term, isn't it? Figure. Well, I figured I would do this, or I figured I would do that. And I had an aunt that would say sometimes, well, you figured with the wrong pencil, didn't you? There are folks who are figures, that they calculate their resources, and there's nothing wrong with evaluating and making plans. The Bible's not telling us that we shouldn't make plans, but it is telling us that we cannot judge, and especially through difficulty in life, we cannot judge just simply by, do we have enough resources? Because I'm here to tell you, if you live your life as a figure, then you're going to come out at the point where it's always going to be not enough. Whenever you ask that question, do I have enough physical resources to do what God's leading me to do? If you live more by figuring than you do by faith, then you're not going to have enough. Do I have enough emotional stamina to be able to accomplish what God has called me to? And I'm here to tell you, if that be the case, then this world is going to pull and pull and pull and draw from your account until you're not going to have enough. So we have to come to that time. And if you live by that sense of just figuring and calculating, am I going to be able to make it through, you're always going to wind up with not enough. And that will lead you to the poor attitude that as you figure, that your figures are a little more important than everybody else's figures. That your time's a little more valuable than everybody else's time. That your energy is a little more valuable than anybody else's time. And that's a danger, a very serious danger in church. If we live by figure, then we're never going to have enough. But then there are the faithers. There are those that believe that God will lead us. But we have to not look at just our circumstance or situation. Our main focus has to be on our relationship and our fellowship and our devotion to the Lord. We have to follow Him. And I can spend a whole lot of time in figuring and let that distract me from my faithfulness to spend time with Jesus. And I'm here to tell you that if my devotion to Christ is not what it's supposed to be in my daily life, in my daily walk, then whatever I do in ministry will never be enough. I'll never have enough stamina. I'll never have enough energy. I'll never have enough money. I'll never have enough status. I'll never have enough whatever. If I'm not walking with Jesus, then everything else is going to come up short. But when we walk by faith, then we come to this point, and I love whenever you can say by faith that I'm not just counting on what I have or what I can figure on, but I'm going to trust that God is able to do the impossible. Is that the kind of faith that we live by? Is that the kind of faith that my family lives by? Is that the kind of faith that I live by? That I believe that God is able to do the impossible. We're not told here in the book of Mark, but over in the book of John, we're told that when Jesus told them, go and survey, see how much food that we have, that there was a little boy, and Andrew found him. I love Andrew. Every place you see Andrew, he's bringing people to Jesus. And we have that Andrew comes to Jesus, and he brings the little boy. Now, we don't know if Andrew just went out and said, hey, has anybody got some fish and loaves or a lunch? And if the little boy, or if the little boy saw that and the little boy came to him, we don't know that. But we know Andrew brought him to Jesus. And I love what Andrew said. He said, Lord, this is what we found. We found 5 loaves and 2 fish. And that would have been great if that would have been all that he said. But then Andrew said, but what is this with so many? Wish he had not said that, but that's the truth. That's where his heart was. But you know what Jesus did? It doesn't say that Jesus said this, but his actions tell him this. That's plenty. And I'm here to tell you that in the midst of problems, our hurts and pains and difficulties and sorrows and sufferings and all the things in life, if you come by faith believing that God can do the impossible, I'll tell you what his reply is going to be. If you will come and give it all to Jesus, and you say, now, Jesus, this is it. You know what his reply to you is going to be? That's plenty. We have to believe that our God can do the impossible. And thereby God will give us whatever we need. That is plenty. It was, if you ask somebody, when did you make your profession of faith? I would say to you, well, I was 9 years old, and tell you about a time in a public service where I came down and made my profession of faith. If I ask you, when did you make your profession of faith, then that's probably the account that you would give. But I declare to you this morning that we ought to make a declaration of our faith. We ought to make a profession of our faith every single circumstance of life. We ought to live our life that everything that we do is a profession of our faith. There was an older gentleman that moved into a retirement home, and he was a rather handsome gentleman. He walked down to the lounge area every morning and drank a cup of coffee, read the paper. And some of the ladies in the retirement home noticed him, and one of those ladies came and she sat down beside him, and he looked up and he noticed that she was staring at him. And so he introduced himself and he said, nice to meet you, and they had a little conversation. Then he went back to his paper, and then he noticed that she was still staring at him, and he said, ma'am, is there something wrong? She said, no, it's just, I'm just amazed. You look so much like my third husband. And he said, really? How many husbands have you had? She said, 2. I call that a profession of faith. Folks, we ought to live our lives every day, and especially during those times when the circumstance is overwhelming, when there are 5,000 that overwhelm us. Instead of us looking into our feelings or our figuring, that we respond by faith. And that we say, I believe that, Jesus, you can do the impossible. The second lesson that the disciples missed that I want us to gain this morning is related to that, but it is not only never measure your solution to your problem just by your own resources, but also know that little is much in the hands of Jesus. Whenever you reach into that pocket and you look how little life is, and you feel that emotional strain, and you feel like you just can't go on, or you feel like the circumstance is so much bigger, and you look out and the hillside is covered, and you don't know how you're going to feed all this in life, then just know that little is much in the hands of Jesus. It's just getting it in the hands of Jesus. Now, we don't know this little boy, whether he volunteered it or if Andrew asked, but he came and he put it in the hands of Jesus. This little boy came prepared. He brought his supper. And he could have just as easily, whenever that time came, slipped behind a rock or leaned up against a tree and said, and I know sometimes you may be thinking, this was not 2 whole catfish plays from Touch of Home, okay? This was just 2, open up a can of sardines and pull out 2 sardines. And these weren't, big, nice yeast rolls. These are probably more like you'd think of as hush puppies. So here this little boy's got 2 sardines and 5 hush puppies. Would have been just enough for him. He would have been satisfied. But he instead put it in the hands of Jesus. Matter of fact, he could have said, you know what, Jesus, I'm going to give you 3 loaves and 1 fish, and I'm going to keep 1 fish and 2 loaves to myself. It'll be enough. It won't be enough to satisfy me, but it'll get me by. And whenever we approach life that way, then it's never going to be enough. We have to learn the lesson that little is much in the hands of Jesus, and he already owns the universe. Do you not recognize that we don't really own anything? We like to think that we own things, but we don't. Whatever you can think of that you own or that you have, whose is it going to be 5 minutes after you die? Well, I'll pass that on to my children. Well, whose is it going to be 5 minutes after your children die? Or 100 years from now? Or 1,000 years from now? Or 1,000,000 years from now? Whose was it 1,000,000 years ago? I don't think there was 1,000,000 years, but in eternity past. It was God's. God owns everything. And we are giving it on loan for just a short period of time. We're giving our children on loan for a short period of time. We're giving the material things of this life for a short period of time. And with ownership comes responsibility. So what I want to do is transfer ownership into the hands of God. And then the responsibility of that falls upon God. And then that way, when the devil comes around and he says, well, you're going to have this need, I can say to him, no, thank you. Whatever you offer, no, thank you, because my needs are supplied according to his riches and glory. So step 1 is transfer the ownership into the hands of God. Step 2 for us is whenever we know that we transfer that into the hands of God, that God transforms that. And he gives it back to us with a blessing. He blesses us with it. Wonderful story over in the book of John chapter 12. And this is after Lazarus has been resurrected. And Jesus comes back into the house of Mary and Martha, and Lazarus is there. And it says that Martha is serving them. You kind of have to know earlier, Martha had been fussing because Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus, and Martha comes in and fusses and says, Lord, make her get up and help me. I'm doing all this work in the kitchen. And Jesus teaches her 11. It just says that she's serving. And Mary comes in, and Mary has this perfume. And it is so expensive, 300 denarii. It'd be more than a year's worth wages. And she comes in, and that she breaks that open, and she anoints the feet of Jesus. And it says that the sweet fragrance and aroma of that perfume filled the room as she anointed the feet of Jesus and then wiped it with her hair. Judas, he wasn't worried about the poor, but he said, this was wasteful. You broke open that box of perfume, and this was wasteful. This could have been sold and given away to the poor. He wasn't worried about the poor. He was worried about himself. He was going to steal the money. But Jesus said, leave her alone, because Jesus knew that he was about to go into the last week of his life, and in a week he would be in the passion, that he would be on the cross. Mary was anointing him for his burial. You know what? Mary gave that to Jesus. But she walked away from that, and the aroma of that was still on her hands, still in her hair. And I believe somehow in the comforting Spirit of God that even as she stood by and she watched him as he received the beating, as she watched him bear Calvary's cross up the hill, as she watched him have the nails pierced through his hands and his feet, as she watched him down the cross, as they removed him, that through that all, that still that aroma still gave her comfort. I'm here to tell you that whatever you have, transfer it to God, and God will take it and he will return it to where when you're going through those difficulties, the aroma of his blessing will still be upon your life. Little is much in the hands of Jesus. One last lesson We need to learn. This may be the most difficult. Sometimes God will allow, sometimes God may even cause difficulty to come into your life so that He can demonstrate that only He can meet that need. When I was in college and seminary, there would be days that the professor would walk in and he would say, okay, put your books up, take out a clean piece of paper, and put your name at the top. And we all knew what that meant. It was a time of test. And it usually meant that we were going to be tested on the material we were supposed to have read the night before. Now, if I had read the material, I'd put my books away and take out that piece of paper with confidence because I was prepared. But honestly, there were times when, I dreaded the test. And I do believe that there are times when God tests our faith so that He can demonstrate to us that He and He alone can meet this need. Let me give you some perspective and ask you to look at the life circumstances through them. The first, I want you to look at the perspective of whatever circumstance, whatever difficulty, whatever test of your faith that you endure with hindsight. We need to all stop and we need to look at what's happened in the past. And in the past, there have been times when we were living back then, when difficulties came and it was like a monster that just sprang upon us and we thought it was going to devour us. But we look back and we understand that God saw us through that time. And it's kind of like the parable of Samson. Samson was a strong man in the Bible. He was a judge over in the Old Testament. And you remember he was Superman and the Hulk and all of them combined into one. He was a Nazarite. God gave him great strength. And as he was making his way down the road one day, a lion pounced out upon him to devour him. And Samson took that lion and he tore him apart. Well, later on, Samson was coming back through and he remembered about that lion. And whenever he came back through to see the carcass of that lion, the birds of prey and all had eaten the flesh off. And bees had come and built a hive inside of the skeleton. And so whenever Samson gets there, he reaches inside that skeleton and gets honey from that. He uses that as a riddle later on. Judges chapter 14 and verse 14 says, this is the riddle he tried to use against the Philistines. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. Well, that is the same riddle for us about life. That when you look in hindsight and you see that lion that pounced on us back then, and yet we look back on that now and there's nothing left of it but just a carcass. There's just a skeleton of the issue and the problem. But as we look back, that we can reach back and see that God saw us through that time, that God helped us through that time, and that there's a sweetness to our life today because of what God's done in the past. Whenever you're having a circumstance or difficulty or whatever it may be that you're looking at in life and you think this is overwhelming, use a little hindsight. Look back in the past and see where God has seen you through in times in the past and find sweetness for today. God saw me through it back then. God will see me through it now. Use some hindsight and then use some foresight. What do we believe is going to happen? I don't know what's going to happen in the next hour. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen a year from now. But I know what's going to happen in eternity. The old hymn writer John Black in 1893 wrote the words to this song. We love to sing them. On that bright and cloudless morning when the dead in Christ shall rise and the glory of His resurrection share, when His chosen ones shall gather to their home beyond the skies, when the roll is called up yonder, I'll be there. I can sing that with confidence. I don't know what tomorrow's going to hold, but I know way up yonder what's going to hold. I'm going to go to heaven. Folks, if I can have the confidence that God's in control of eternity and in control of heaven, why in the world can I not see that today? Romans chapter 8 and verse 18 says, For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Use a little hindsight. See how God's seen you through. Find sweetness in that today. Use a little foresight. Know the promise of heaven and claim that. And then use a little insight. And look into what God has done, will done, and He can do. Know that Romans 8:28, everything have insight into life. For we know that all things work together for the good to those who love God and who are the called according to His purpose. It doesn't say some things or a few things. It says all things. Young people, let me share something. There's something in your house that's probably either white or maybe stainless steel or black. And used to in olden days, people could mix something up and put it in there and and it would produce a cake. It's called an oven. Some of you still use an oven. I love cake. You love cake? Man, I love chocolate cake. I love strawberry cake. I love pound cake. I love cake. If it's got cake in it, I love cake. But wouldn't it be hard just to sit down with a spoon and eat a cup of sugar? Wouldn't it be hard then to take and eat 3 eggs? Wouldn't it be hard to take a spoon and eat a cup of flour? Even if you could wash it down with a cup of milk. Wouldn't it be hard to eat a whole stick of butter? But it's something else when you take all those ingredients and you mix them all together and you put it under some heat and it produces something good. It's called cake. Well, it may be hard going through some of the things and taking all the ingredients of life, and it may be hard as you look at those ingredients and thinking, oh, I just don't have the resources. I just don't know that I can do that. But whenever you put that into the hand of God and He mixes all that together and then He puts it under some heat, and it's the heat that makes the cake. And sometimes the heat of life, we don't like enduring it. But all things work together for the good to those who love God and who are the called according to His purpose. Whenever I just look at one time or 1 month or one situation or one circumstance, and I see the pain and the sorrow and the suffering, and I see that and I say, oh, I don't know that I can endure that. But when you put all that together and you put it in the hands of God, then you know when it's in His hands, that it's going to make something good and beautiful. There's a story told about a great musician who was coming to town, wonderful violinist. Everybody was excited that the concert was going to be in their town. And the word spread rapidly that he was going to be playing in a priceless Stradivarius. Everybody was so excited. So the night of the concert came. The concert hall was filled. You could just hear the excitement in the crowd. And in just a few minutes before the concert, then one of the workers rolled out on a stand that violin, and everybody sat there and looked at it and oohed and awed. And then finally, the violinist stepped out. And he picked up that violin and he picked up the bow, and he began to play out such beautiful music that there was just a hush that fell on the concert hall as that beautiful music just filled the room. And they all sat there in awe. When he finished that, everybody was almost too afraid, too reverent even to clap. But it just so filled their hearts. And then that violinist laid down his bow. He held out that violin, and he held it by the head, and he crashed it on the table. Splinters went everywhere. And the crowd, you could just hear, is almost one gasp at one time that went across the crowd. And then the violinist said this: you heard that as I was coming to town that I would be playing a priceless Stradivarius. And many of you sat here and looked at this violin before I ever came out, and you were so looking forward to what sounds would come out of that priceless violin. I'm here to tell you what I just crashed over this table was what filled this room up and that you awed over was a cheap violin that I bought in a pawn shop earlier this afternoon and polished it up and put new strings on it. What you've heard was not because of the violin, it was because of the musician. And then they brought out the Stradivarius. And as people drank in the beauty of the music, they realized that it wasn't the instrument. It was in the hands of the master. Folks, whenever we look at life, it's not you and me or the moment or the circumstances. We have to realize is if we put it in the hands of the master, then he will do more with it than we could ever imagine. Will we live by that kind of